John? John?
Oh, she's there.
We need you. Okay.
Are you giving us a red card? Do we have to leave now?
Thank you so much. Hopefully everyone in the room can hear me. Thank you so much, John, for that introduction and also for inviting me to speak here in Ottawa. It's always a joy to be in Ottawa. I have to admit, I didn't always love Ottawa as a Western Canadian and as a libertarian. I always kind of had this grudge against Ottawa, but then I moved to Ottawa, so after I finished grad school, I worked for the federal government for a short time, and it was here in Ottawa that I met my husband. So I can't hold a grudge against the city any longer. I've got nothing but good memories. So it's good to be back, and thank you specifically to my husband, Kaz, for taking the effort to join me here. So when John first reached out to me to come speak to you today, I was really excited. This is one of those issues that I can't get enough of. I'm so interested in it, and the more I learn, the more I realize there is to learn. And I was sort of torn on, what should I talk about? Should I provide a wholesome critique of modern feminism and all the harmful intended and unintended consequences that it has on our society? Or should I offer something different and provide a defense, a new defense from a young person on the institution of marriage and how important marriage is to both men and women and how it can help us address the problems that we face. So I'm going to try to, instead of just talking about how I hate feminism or how I love marriage, I'm going to try to weave the two together in this 15 minutes. So let's see how that goes. So if we were to ask 1,000 Canadians, say 1,000 consumers of the mainstream media, folks who read the Ottawa Citizen and watch the CBC, we were to ask them to tell us what the top issues facing girls and women in this country. What do you think they would say? What do you think that the examples would be of the major issues facing girls? Anyone like to take a stab at that? Yeah. Rape culture, yeah, that's definitely something you hear about. And domestic violence, oppressed. Exactly, the pay gap, rape culture, lack of affordable daycare maybe. Something about a crisis of mansplaining or manspreading is the latest thing. Toxic masculinity, right. Everything is sort of a critique about the system loosely defined as the patriarchy. There's no shortage of these problems that are highlighted by people in my profession, by the mainstream media. And there's no shortage of women who have devoted their entire lives, their entire careers, to both drumming up anger over these issues and rallying and creating support. Imagine that, dedicating your entire life to some of these issues. They've made an entire industry of it. There's government agencies all devoted to this, to solving these supposed problems. And I think worst of all is that there's an entire generation of young women out there who are being raised to believe that they are victims, that here in Canada, here in the most prosperous, free country, at a time where women have never had more choice and more opportunity, that they're growing up to believe that they're victims of some invisible oppression. So this is interesting. I was walking, I parked my car at the Toronto Women's Hospital the other day, and I was making my way through the lobby, and I noticed that there was a sign. There's an ad campaign that's throughout Toronto. Let me tell you if this, let me ask if this exists in Ottawa as well. But there was all these signs and posters talking about something called the health gap. So you see these brightly colored advertisements and posters, and the ad says something along the lines of, we've all heard of the pay gap, we all know the pay gap is this terrible thing affecting women, but did you know that there's also a health gap? A health gap? I'd never heard of this before. Has anyone heard of this so-called health gap? Okay, well, I appreciate the irony of standing in a modern, beautiful, newly renovated, state-of-the-art hospital that's built exclusively for women and women's health. One of the richest cities in the world, and to stay covered in ads complaining about women somehow being neglected and mistreated. It's funny, of course, considering that there's no men's hospital in Toronto, there's no men's hospital anywhere in Canada. And as soon as you dig in a little bit, which I went home and started Googling it, I wanted to find out about this so-called health gap. The reality is that per capita health spending on women is about 23% more than it is on men. In the US, it's the same thing. Overall health spending on women is about $1.3 trillion. It's about 1 billion for men. That's not a trivial rounding error. That's hundreds of millions of dollars. So, there's obviously a perfectly good explanation as to why us as a society spend more money on women's health. It's biological, basic biology. Women have babies, they need maternal health spending, and that's a major reason. But why do we have this hospital creating a campaign telling us that we need to spend more money and that we need to give more attention to eliminating this supposed gap? Well, of course, everyone in this room knows that the health gap isn't the only myth that's pushed and perpetuated in our society. And as soon as you do a little bit of research into any of these so-called crises facing women, whether it's the pay gap, or rape culture, or mansplaining, you realize that they're all based on just very thin arguments and mostly just misinformation. So I want to take a few minutes to just take on the wage gap, because that's the one that we probably hear about the most, and anyone who reads my column in The Sun knows that it's sort of a particular pet peeve of mine that there's this myth that's perpetuated. So depending on your source and how left-wing it is, you've probably heard about this gender gap, pay gap, that's anywhere between 13 and 30%. Of course, the dirty little secret about the pay gap is that it does not compare apples to apples. It doesn't compare doctors to doctors or teachers to teachers. Instead, it's a just totally one-dimensional look at the data. It doesn't look at any variable whatsoever other than gender. So it doesn't take into account any of the things that would determine how much a person gets paid or earns, be it their education, profession, occupation, experience, age, number of hours worked, their parental status, their union status. It doesn't look at anything. It literally just takes all the women in the society, looks at the average wage, compares that to all the men working in the economy, compares that to their average wage, and that's a really bad, unscientific way of calculating a so-called wage gap. So if we want to know what's really going on, we have to obviously compare for other factors. We have to compare workaholic men to workaholic women. When we do that, it's a bit different. There is a gap between what men and women earn overall, but it's much smaller. Even Statistics Canada, according to their data, it's only 8%. So it's not as big as what the media will lead you to believe. It still does exist, but there are obviously other factors that are other differentiations between men and women. So women on average work fewer hours than men. Men are more likely to pursue higher paid positions in professions like engineering. They're more likely to relocate for a job, and more likely to prioritize their work over other things, be it leisure or travel or time with family. Men choose to work more. And men also take on a lot more risks. So yeah, there's economic gain to that, but there's also really, really catastrophic downsides as well. Men are more likely to go bankruptcy. They're 20 times more likely to die in the workplace, and 97% of all workplace deaths in this country are men. So once again, you don't hear men complaining about the death gap, but there is a considerable death gap in our society on average. Women also live about 4 years longer than men. So far from some sort of conspiracy against women, it's the men who take on the dirty and dangerous jobs in our society, and they usually do so in support of the women in their lives, and I think that's an incredibly important point to emphasize. And again, the gap that does exist, it's mostly a motherhood gap. It's not a men versus women gap. There's been lots of studies in Scandinavia that show that when men and women start having a family, the woman's hours drop a lot, and the men, correspondingly, their hours increase. They work more, they work harder, they try to earn more money for their family to pay the bills while the wife is staying at home with the children. So it really boils down to the choices that women make, and not some kind of conspiracy theory or sexism or any of the things that we're told to believe. So if a woman wanted to earn more, she can. She just needs to make different choices in her life. So she could become an engineer. She could work more hours. She could choose not to get married and choose not to have children. Of course, the reality is that most women don't want to make those specific choices, and they don't. So instead of social engineering, using gender quotas, Trudeau's favorite thing, insistence on the equality of outcome, we should really celebrate the freedom that women have in their lives and continue to let women make the choices that serve them best in their lives. But that's the whole thing. That's the whole thing about feminism, is that it's not really about what is best for women. Feminism is based on an ideological crusade. It's more or less similar to Marxism. It's about claiming that men are the oppressors, the women are the victims, and that in order to fix this ongoing power imbalance, the only thing we can do is to tear down the patriarchy. The patriarchy, which is basically just our Western liberal democracy. It's basically just free markets and individual choice and rule of law. And that's how it sounds a lot like Marxism. So if I had time, I could go through basically every other one of these issues that we've talked about that affect women and talk about how they're basically based on flimsy evidence. The reality is that women have it really good in our society. So back to my original question. Sorry, John, was there something? Oh, okay, back to the original survey question that I wanted to think about. You know, if we were to ask those 1,000 Canadians, again, those same 1,000 Canadians, those people who read the Toronto Star and watch the CBC every night, if we were to ask them, what are the top issues facing boys and men in our society? Would there be any consensus? Would there even be any knowledge of what those issues are? What are the unique issues that boys and men face?
White male privilege.
Male privilege. Yeah. Well, interestingly, I Googled this, and when I Googled, you know, top women's issues in Canada, there's no shortage of websites and campaigns and op-eds and editorials and news stories and everything you can think of talking about the issues that affect girls. When I did the same thing for boys, however, the Google results told me about the top political issues in Canada, the top national issues in Canada, and then of course I got a barrage of pages about feminism and back to the women's issues. There weren't even any search results about the top issues facing boys and men, so even Google is guilty of ignoring the plight of boys and men in our society. Now, reality, and everyone again in this room already knows, but there are quite a few unique challenges facing boys and men. And you know, the long-term consequences of these issues, if they're not addressed, they're going to have an impact on every person in society, men and especially women. So the first and major one is that boys are falling behind in school. Schools favor girls over boys, and they often punish boys for just being boys. Boys are told that their rambunctiousness, their high-spiritedness or competitiveness, their sort of affinity for rough and tumble play, that all these things are just examples of toxic masculinity and they need to be taught out of these boys. So good kids, good boys are being punished, suspended, expelled from school just for being themselves and just acting according to their nature. And this is the effect of 2 generations of feminism and affirmative action that promote girls over boys and punish boys for being boys. And as a result, women do better in school, and because of that, more go to university, more graduate. And for men, there's sort of been a corresponding drop. So as women's rates are getting better, men's are going down. And you know, there are some things, you know, that we're celebrating women, and it's not just. Perhaps if you're an ideological feminist, this sounds great. You know, women are taking over the world, they're taking over the schools, they're taking over the professions. That might be great news, but the reality is that this shift in career expectations over just, you know, one generation has a total ripple effect that could have a devastating impact on our society, on both men and women. So recent data that I found in 2010 showed that about 31% of households in Canada have a female breadwinner. So the woman, the wife, is either the primary income earner or she makes more money than her husband. So if you think back about the fact that the wage gap is really more of a motherhood gap, you can think about how this will impact. So, you know, biologically, women bear children, and therefore, men have traditionally taken on the burden of providing for his family, providing for his wife, and earning a living, while the woman stays at home with the children during those crucial years. This is the foundation of traditional marriage. And it's really for the purpose of the next generation, the offspring, doing what's best for the children, and that used to be at the forefront of our thinking. This is what we used to prioritize. And so both men and women have their unique burdens, their unique responsibilities, and there is this agreed upon division of labor in the household. Probably biologically, women prefer to stay home with their kids. They take better care of the young, where the men are better suited to go out and earn a living. Now, of course, these are gender stereotypes, and they're not all true. That's what early feminism was about giving women and men the opportunity to break out of this mold. Some men are more caring and more nurturing and are better suited at home. Some women might be more mechanical or better suited to go on and take on the workforce. And we shouldn't all be bound by one rigid set of standards. But we also shouldn't throw these standards out the window entirely, and that's what feminism has done. Because the reality is most people do fit into these gender stereotypes more or less. More or less, women would prefer to stay home during these crucial years. So as women excel in school and higher education, they pursue these higher jobs, and then they become their own breadwinner. So today, increasingly, I see this a lot among my peers and women I grew up with. Women are kind of expected to forego or delay motherhood. They sacrifice their time with their young people, with their young children. If they do have kids, there's an emphasis to just rush and get back to work. So women have this expectation of both bringing in money and taking care of the financials of the family, but then they're also stuck with this traditional role of raising and bearing the children. You know, it's frankly making women unhappy. Women are deeply unhappy. Statistics show women have never been less happy as they have recently. So women are unhappy, but it's also making men unhappy. Men see themselves as being replaced. They're struggling to find a role, to find meaning, to find purpose in a new world crafted by feminists that place the burden on women and try to erase men entirely from our society. So men in North America are now 5 times more likely to commit suicide than women. Many men refuse to grow up. Many are stuck in this sort of perpetual phase of adolescence. And believe me, I spend a lot of time on social media and on Twitter and YouTube, and there's a lot of men that are just sort of stuck in this sort of angry adolescent stage. And you know, it's sad. It's sad that there's this sort of crisis among men and it's being ignored. So, you know, that's the fundamental problem with feminism, is it pits women against men, it bruises resentment, it emphasizes to the point of propaganda the issues facing girls and women, and then it completely ignores and often even covers up the very serious problems facing men and boys in our society. And we really shouldn't think of these problems as sort of men versus women dichotomy, since most families consist of both men and women. We're in it together. And I think that's where the solution lies. So I wanted to weave this discussion at the end and talk a little bit about a defense of marriage and sort of the traditional gender roles that I was talking about. And I say this as someone who grew up playing ice hockey, and I was a tomboy growing up, and I used to get kicked out of class for being rambunctious too, and I'm someone who has a career, and I love my job and my career. But I think that, you know, in the solution is to stop pitting men against women, and start to work together to address the unique issues and problems that we all face. So both men and women have these unique burdens and responsibilities, but we also have unique talents, unique privileges, and unique opportunities. And marriage really helps us understand the other gender, the perspective of the other person and where they're coming from. And it really makes you have a stake in the well-being of the other gender as well. So being married, I think, is like having a superpower. You have another person that can help you through the most challenging moments of your life. You also have someone who is there to share, to cherish in the most rewarding moments of your life. You have a best friend and a partner, and you know, it could be someone of the same gender, of course, but you know, typically it's someone of the opposite gender, and they help you through the challenges of life. So taking on this responsibility, having this purpose, taking care of other people, these are the things that really bring meaning to one's life. And this is the most important thing that we should strive for. And especially, you know, obviously marriage, you have to be with the right person, but they give you the confidence and the drive to excel. So not only is marriage good for your confidence and your mental health, it's also good for your physical health and your wealth. Married couples live longer and healthier lives, and that's regardless of any other factor: age, sex, race, education, income. Married couples are also significantly wealthier. People who graduate from high school, get some work experience, get married and have children, in that order, are 500% less likely to live in poverty than people who don't do those things, and marriage is the single most important factor. So again, I think of marriage as a superpower, not just for those reasons, but it's also a kryptonite against the poisonous ideologies like feminism. It's hard to really buy into the idea that men are these oppressive beings when you think of your own husband, or when you think of your father, your brother, you know, your family are perfect examples of how men aren't these things that they tell you they are in university classrooms. So while the feminists and the Marxists of the world will pit us against each other and push these culture wars, I think the best way to fight back is by rejecting this narrative and promoting our own, which is tradition. And so feminists wage their war on men. We should fight back with our own ideas: marriage, family, tradition, responsibility, and duty. Those things will trump angry feminists every time. Thank you.